Fantastic. Well, it is really wonderful, not just to be here at this conference, but also to hear of the fantastic work and plans of EXPMR. I lead within DIME, and then also as a collaboration with the governance practice of the World Bank, something that we call the Bureaucracy Lab. And it's got a very similar set of aims to what I understand EXPMR is trying to do. So what I thought I would do is, before I present one of the pieces of analytical work within a particular country that we've done as part of our team's work, I'd like to just give you a few moments talking about what the Bureaucracy Lab is and what we're trying to do. So the Bureaucracy Lab is about 5 years old, and we take research very seriously. We want to do research of the highest quality, but we also appreciate that that research should be policy relevant. And so our aim is to try and combine research and operations in a very tight way. And so like DIME does in so much of its work, but particularly here with the governance practice, we work really on a daily basis as collaborators with our operational colleagues. And so what we formed is an entity that has both DIME and the World Bank's operational lending arm as a single entity under this banner of the Bureaucracy Lab. And fundamentally what we want to do is we want to innovate bureaucracy through better data and empirics. What do we mean by that? The world has seen a transformation in both the available data that we have, the cost of data, but also in the analytical methods. The kind of approach that an analyst is trained in graduate school, like myself, to try and break down a problem, try and understand the impact of PSM, or as I'll talk about, culture, has moved a lot in the last 30 years. And yet the public sector hasn't yet inculcated this an analytical approach in many cases. And so we just simply want to bring those methods and data production systems to the heart of the public administration. So we have a number of ways that we've tried to go about doing this. We try to produce global public goods. So we have a cross-country data set called the Worldwide Bureaucracy Indicators, which really is using the bank's household surveys to understand the labor markets in the public and private sectors. We're undertaking surveys with a consortium, including Christian Schuster at UCL and Frank Fukuyama's team at Stanford, that tries to actually put together a data set that's coherent across countries and does what the bank's done with citizens and poor households, with businesses, to actually do that with the public administration. And we're calling that the Global Survey of Public Servants. So we've produced lots of global aspects of that, a survey manual, comms guidelines, how to do a census for public service and so forth. But now we've done 32 countries, and the idea is to eventually do what the bank's done elsewhere and bring together in a harmonized way data on the public service that is comparable and that is grounded in the very best methodologies. We are undertaking a handbook of measurement where we actually experiment, not simply experiment with notions and items that might matter for public service performance, but with the methods of how do you actually go and measure the public service. We've, in many of those 32 surveys, undertaken some sort of experiment. And then we do a range of knowledge and products and events. We also do country level work. So our operational colleagues will often ask, can you support us in fiscal sustainability or wage bill modeling, to do public sector labor market analysis, or as we now group our public employee surveys or productivity measures and experiments together, institutional capability assessments. So just to give you a flavor of that and sort of advertise, do go and check out the WWBI. We're constantly updating it. We have a new version planned using wage data that the bank's been able to access from around the world. It has compression ratios, comparisons for male and female and within different sectors, really across the world. And for many countries, we have a panel structure. So it could be useful, at least for the introductions of your papers, or when you're thinking about how wage policies should be set within your organization. This is a nice thing to have as a sort of comparator. We also do a lot of work on wage data, and we just like to always make a claim to researchers and policymakers such as yourself to say, the data that the government already has, say, just in its personnel system, is a fascinating way to start to understand what the labor market looks like. What does the transition of pay look like for individuals? What we see in so much, and this is what this graph shows, is that you see huge pay variation at different years of service. And the question is, how does that come about? How does that arise? You know, similarly, we've tried to measure not just the standard pay and so forth, but also think about what does management look like in the public service. So this is an example from Ghana, from work I've done with Imran Rasool and Martin Williams at Oxford. And we've measured management across Ghana's public service organizations. And what this graph tells you is two things. Whatever you think the national quality of government is in Ghana, that is dwarfed by the variation we see across the organizations of Ghana's public service. And then I'm going to take you a step further. The organizations are represented here by solid dots. Within each organization, we also measured unit level quality of management. And what you see is that the variation across organizations is dwarfed by unit level variation. So something about the public sector means that simply walking across the corridor from one unit to another transforms the management environment. And what does that mean for productivity? So we're trying to create a very micro measurement system for really public administration across the world. Now, of course, we do experiments, and I'm about to expound on one of my experiments. But really, what we're trying to push here is to create micro data of on the public administration at massive scale. That's rigorous surveys of public officials, assessments of individual unit and organizational productivity, understanding how these very important interactions between members of staff, individual units and so forth, affect productivity. Because we know that unlike almost anywhere in the world, the public sector and the public administration is based on teamwork. And then if we can link these to frontline service delivery indicators, we'll start to really be able to understand the role that public administration, civil service and so forth plays in our everyday lives. So now I've introduced a little bit, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on where we should go and what we should do. What I'd like to do is I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the specific experiments that we've run. So I'm just going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to now turn to the slides of actually specific project that I've been working on in Ghana. This is a project that's recently been released. Can everyone see the slides, can training improve organizational culture? Can that be seen?
Oh, yes, we can see it.
Very good. All right. So this work is with Michel Azoulay, Imran Rasool, and Martin J. Williams. What it tries to do is it tries to understand what is the role of training, not simply in capacity building, because public services across the world invest a lot in training. And the idea is typically just to simply provide content, is to just inform public servants. But we know that public servants have a tremendous amount of their own decision-making on a daily basis as to whether they adhere to the procedure, process, the content that they've been taught. So really, it's a cultural question. Really, the question is, to what extent can we move individual public servants' own beliefs over what they should be doing, the culture of the public service, towards better process, improved outcomes? So organizational culture, we believe, and we think that there's a relatively strong pre-existing literature saying, is important for how the bureaucracy functions. What we really mean by that is just some sort of shared expectation of behavior. The norms and the cognitive frames that shape behavior. And that's particularly important in the public sector, as I say, because so much of how the public administration works cannot be written down. It's not measurable. It's simply the extent to which individual public servants feel that they should adhere to the right practices. You know, this is important because the public sector has team production. As I said, it's highly discretionary, and there's a lot of collaboration. And so how people see each other in terms of creating joint outputs really matters.
Daniel, sorry for the interruption. Could you begin screen sharing again?
Yes.
We're experiencing technical difficulties here.
So I've now stopped. And I've started. Is that working?
Yes, thank you.
And yet, given the relative importance of it, there really is very limited evidence on the extent to which we can change culture, particularly in the public service. There's some evidence, qualitative evidence, that it is possible to change the culture of a public sector organization. And in the private sector, just very recently, there are publications showing that it is possible to change the way people see their role within private sector organizations. So what we're trying to ask is, can training be slightly modified to be not simply about content, but actually about changing culture and performance? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push up and to tell me if the slide actually does. So does that slide now show? So it should say training on it.
Yes, it's working now.
Okay, fantastic. Now, interestingly, training, albeit one of the most important activities in the public service, when a lot of money is spent in it, is actually overlooked in empirical work. So if many of you will know the Finnan et al. Sort of review, and actually Imran has a review of public service research. And in fact, there is almost no literature in those review pieces that looks at training. And so what we really want to start to understand is, well, how does training shape how bureaucrats think and work? And as I said, we can think of this in terms of skills, so updating the content they know, but also what they think they should be doing. So what we do is we work with Ghana's civil service, and this is how the Bureaucracy Lab typically works, very much in partner with our government colleagues. So Ghana's civil service has roughly 3,000 civil servants. It's quite a small civil service. Of course, the public service is much larger. It has many agencies, but we're going to focus here on the core public administrators. And these people are in central government, so they all live in the capital city. They do policy making, oversight. These are not doctors and nurses. These are administrators. And typically, once every few years, they will go for a 10-day training, what's called scheme of service, at the Civil Service Training Centre. And all staff must do this on a regular basis if they're going to continue to be promoted. You typically will sit in a hall with 10 to 40 other civil servants, and they used to have a productivity scheme where you'd have one day and you'd think about productivity as a concept. But really what was happening in these public service trainings was that you were just being told what updated procedures were and just being given some sense of how the public service has changed as a whole. It was relatively abstract. It was based really on content, and there was almost no discussion of what should I do when I go back to my division to change the way that we work. Now, to be clear, the people who are in this training that we're going to experiment on is a selected sample, because it's the people who chose to go to training that year. But as I said, the whole service goes to training in one of 3 or 4 years. So this is just the set of people who went for training in that year. So there was, as I said, some pre-existing discussion of productivity. They in fact used the Japanese Kaizen process, but it wasn't made practical. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. But rather they just talked about the principles of Kaizen. What we did is we said, well, let's actually convert this day, a single day out of the 10, into a completely productivity and process change sort of action-oriented training module. So what we did is we worked with an international consultancy who has designed a lot of civil service training. We worked with trainers from CSTC. And what we said was, let's use pre-existing data on what productivity looks like in your division. Let's have a think about how you're going to take one of the strategic procedures that you think is most important and actually change it. Let's write out an action plan. Let's show a film that shows you how the other people have changed this. And we take them through step by step what happens the day after they leave the training and actually go and start making change in the public service. All right. We used things like fishbones to understand the people that they were going to have to change the minds of, the environment that they were going back into. We motivated them by making videos about people who had actually made change in their division. And what we found, and this is some descriptive evidence of what the trainings look like. So this column is our assessment of what trainings looked like at baseline in the control group. The second column is an individual-led training, and I'll describe in a moment how we also used a team-based training. But you can see from both of these that people were more engaged, much more use of teamwork, much more use of role plays. It was much more practical than the baseline training. We used more civil service examples. Fundamentally, we changed a single day of productivity training to try and capitalize on what had gone before, to try and catalyze people to take their 2 weeks training and actually change something in the public service. Okay, so what do we have? Our notion of this was that it might be hard for a single individual to actually change the culture of an entire division. So maybe we should split between individual training and a training where we actually train the entire division. It is ambiguous, however, as to which of these is going to work, because an individual can act as a leader. A single person who takes on the role of reform and change knows that the weight of that change and that reform is on his or her shoulders. Once you move to a team-based system, then of course pre-existing dynamics may solidify and there may be more resistance to change. We might find that individuals then free ride on their colleagues. And so it's an interesting economic question to us whether individual productivity training or team-based training might actually change the ability to transform content into actual reform. So we had individual-based training inside Civil Service Training Center. This is people from across divisions being brought together, just like most civil service training, and then working together on their normal civil service training, including our randomized to what we call training for productivity, this kind of practical action plan oriented training. So we're going to have a control group and then some people who train at the Civil Service Center in our new action plan oriented training. And then we're going to choose a subset of all trainees, so some in control and some in our advanced action plan training. And we're going to go into their divisions and train the whole division. So let me show you that in a diagram. All civil servants are eligible for this 10-day training, but there's non-random selection to who was training and who wasn't. But then we take the people who were in training and we randomize them into either our action plan training or the standard more abstract training where they're not trying to convert it into reform. And then from all of those groups, we do some what's called T2 or team-based training. Okay. So this is large scale. It's a third of all professional civil servants involved in the training. Now we had some implementation difficulties and I actually would love to talk to the XPMR faculty about the experience they've had on that. So we'll go to that later. We did a real range of data collection. The idea for us wasn't just to measure what happens on training day, but to go back into the division time and time again over a long period and really understand exactly what happened to procedures at each stage. So we actually spent about 18 months tracking what happened to the civil servants that we trained. So we obviously did short-term learning gains using exams, but then we went back and we said, to what extent have people remembered what they're actually being trained in? We asked about organizational culture, which will be an important outcome for us. But we also tracked the quality of process within the public service by taking files out of the office and having ex-civil servants audit them. We looked at the extent to which there was task completion. We looked at measures of management quality. And so what we have is 18 months of an incredibly refined and detailed description of what the public service looks like. So what do we find? So I'm just pulling tables here from a paper that gives this in much more detail, and I'm happy to send it. I've also included it in the link to the conference organizers, so potentially they'll send it around. So what we have here is a table at the individual trainee level, and we've selected some samples, which I can describe in more detail. But fundamentally, what we're asking is, firstly, do people learn anything from civil service training? We actually find that they do, about 10 percentage points, 27 percentage points increase in their exam scores. What about learning in our additional training modules? Well, we see no reduction in how much they're learning on our non-TFP, and a 7.5 percentage point increase in how much they're learning about our modules. Now, that doesn't sound huge, but the baseline is only 35% of answers are actually filled in correctly, so this is a relatively large proportion. What's interesting here is that T2, individuals learned more. So if you go and teach people with their whole division, they're actually learning more. If we stop the evaluation here, you would think that T2 was wildly successful and T1 was only marginally successful. So let's remember that. What, of course, we didn't want to do was just stop with short-term effects. So we went then back 6 months later and tested everyone again. What do we find? Well, we find actually that that 7 or 8 percentage point increase in knowledge persisted for T1. So what we find is that individual civil servants on the TFP-related productivity knowledge, they continued to have a higher score than they had and their colleagues. Interestingly, T2 starts to fall. If you learn with your colleagues, for some reason, there's no incentive to continue to acquire and sustain that knowledge. So then we ask them, to what extent did you actually follow up on your training? So we see zero effect on our measures for our group-based training. We start to see some effect on T1. So if you're trained as an individual, we see that people were trying to break down the obstacles to applying the learning. And we have an index of a range of measures, and we find that people are actually starting to try and implement some of the things that they learned 6 months later. So interestingly now, having taken a first cut of, is team training better than individual training? If you take the early results, you're getting very different results to the medium and long term. What do we find on culture? So what this table does is it just outlines how we measured culture. We took a famous healthcare-related office or workplace culture index called Sexton. It's by Sexton et al. Happy to share it. And we just changed it slightly to become more civil service related. So the scale items we're asking are things like, you would feel happy being served as a Ghanaian citizen by this division, or trainees in your division are adequately supervised, or staff in this division are quick to adopt new ways of doing things. And so what we can now do is assess the extent to which the experimental variation in training actually impacts culture. What do we find? What we see is that T1, individual training, where individual leaders are asked to go back and change the culture of their public service, are having robust effects on culture, on the teamwork climate, on performance climate, on fostering new ideas, on their relative performance. We see absolutely no effect of individual training. So what does this mean? It means that because these are relative to SOS, which is the standard training in the public service, is that standard public service training is having no effect on team culture. It's not having any effect on the actual process of getting the reforms implemented in the divisions. Team training, similarly, is not. But if you craft leaders, then they're able to go back into the individual divisions that they work in across the public service and start to change the way that those divisions work. What are they specifically trying to improve? So we tracked at a number of points, and I'm going to show you 18 months out, the extent to which they were actually able to change the performance and management of their organizations. Now, let me take a moment and tell you that about 2/3 of all civil servants are asking or telling us that they want to change public service procedure. And so what we see in this table is a series of measures of administrative quality. They simply want to take their division to what they're supposed to be doing, so adhere to the correct procedure as written in the public service rules. That is the reform that they're going to try and take back into their public service. And we see exactly that when we randomly take files out of the service and audit them using ex-civil servants. We see that the quality of procedural adherence by these leaders in T1 actually increases by 1/3 of a standard deviation. So there's huge improvement in the quality of procedure and adherence to procedure. But interestingly, they're not trying to improve the content of the work that public servants do. This filters through to an 11% increase, significant at the 10% level, but an 11% increase in task completion off a baseline task completion of about 24%. So that is a huge change, both in the ability of these trainees, these leaders, by small changes in the way they're trained to go and affect culture, adhere the division to procedure that they've just been taught the content of, and this is having effects, or at least it's associated with effects on task completion. What they're not being able to do, as can be seen by the null results here, though these are positive and quite large effects, 0.24 of a standard deviation, 0.27, 0.24 of a standard deviation, is change management quality itself, because of course that's being affected by many other things. These leaders are targeting individual procedures and bringing their divisions up to a certain quality. We have a number of Wald and Anderson tests to really show that this is not, we're basically trying to do some multiple hypothesis adjustments. But fundamentally, the story is here. The public service can make small changes in the way it works. And then labs, such as those at KDI, can track the way that public services are functioning after those small changes. And we can sketch out not just the immediate, but the medium and long-term consequences of those small changes. And as this shows, small changes in training can affect culture, procedure, and output in a consequential way. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be very happy to talk more about the results. The paper is online, and we'd be happy to share absolutely any of the instruments, of the underlying curriculum, whatever can help you either do good analytical work or change your public service for the better. That's why the Bureaucracy Lab is here. Thank you very much.